Deep inside the records room of the Harrison County Courthouse, there was once a leather-bound ledger unlike any other. Its pages meticulously chronicled every transaction tied to Bella of Plantation, each sale, transfer, and exchange of property carefully recorded in ink. For years, it sat undisturbed on a dust-coated shelf, just another forgotten volume among thousands of ordinary public records. That changed in the spring of 1891. Late one night, long after the courthouse had emptied, Judge Theodore Harriman entered the records room alone. No clerks accompanied him. No official request was filed. When he emerged nearly 3 hours later, one thing was missing. The ledger was gone, and it was never seen again. What secrets were buried within those pages? What could compel a respected judge to risk his career, his reputation, and his freedom to erase a public record? And which powerful families whose names still adorn banks, courthouses, and universities today were so determined to sever their ties to Bella of Plantation that they engineered one of the most deliberate cover-ups in Southern history. This is not a tale of ghosts or superstition. It is a story of power, of how far people will go to protect their legacy, and of those who refuse to let the truth vanish, even when silence would have been far safer. Benjamin Walsh was one of those people. For 11 years, Walsh had worked at the Harrison County Courthouse as a records clerk. At 34, he had no grand ambitions. His life followed a steady, predictable rhythm, filing deeds, transcribing wills, cataloging the endless paper trail of lives lived and lost in Mississippi. He wore the same gray vest each day, carried his lunch in a tin pail, and walked the same route home every evening. It was precisely this consistency, this devotion to routine, that made him notice when something was wrong. The morning of April 14, 1891 began no differently than any other. Benjamin arrived at the courthouse at exactly 7 o'clock, unlocked the records room, and began his daily inventory. The courthouse demanded precision from its clerks. Every document accessed, every file removed, every ledger borrowed had to be logged complete with a signature and a precise timestamp. And that morning, one entry was missing. The night log sat on the desk where the evening clerk always left it. Benjamin picked it up, expecting to see it blank. The courthouse closed at 6. No one should have been in the records room after hours. But there, in careful handwriting, was a single entry. April 13, 1891. 11:47 p.m. Judge T. Harriman, Property Records, Bella of Plantation, 1855 to 1868. Return 2:33 a.m. Benjamin read the entry 3 times. Judge Harriman had spent nearly 3 hours reviewing old plantation records in the middle of the night. It made no sense. Bella had been abandoned for over 20 years. The plantation house had burned in 1869. And the land had been divided and sold off in pieces throughout the 1870s. There was no active litigation concerning the property. No reason for a judge to review those records, especially not at midnight. Benjamin walked to Section K where pre-war plantation documents were stored. He found the shelf easily enough. There was a gap where the Bella ledger should have been, but the ledger itself was nowhere in sight. His stomach tightened. He checked the return log. Nothing. The book hadn't been officially checked back in, despite Judge Harriman's notation that he'd returned it at 2:33 a.m. Benjamin stood in the quiet records room, dust particles floating through shafts of morning light, and felt the first whisper of something wrong. In 11 years, he had never known Judge Harriman to access records personally. Judges sent clerks. Judges made requests through proper channels. And judges certainly didn't visit the courthouse alone at midnight. He could ignore this. He could pretend he hadn't noticed. But Benjamin Walsh was a man who believed in order in the proper place of things. A missing ledger was disorder, and disorder demanded correction. Theodore Harriman was not a man people questioned. At 56 years old, he had served on the circuit court bench for 18 years. He came from old Mississippi stock. His grandfather had been a senator. His father a decorated colonel in the Mexican War. The Harriman name appeared on hospital wings and library dedications. Judge Harriman himself lived in a stately home on Magnolia Avenue, attended First Presbyterian Church and was known for his fair but firm judgments. He was also known for something else: his friendship with the most influential families in 3 counties. When Benjamin Walsh approached his supervisor, Mr. Gerald Pitts, about the missing ledger, Pitts barely looked up from his desk. "Judge Harriman is conducting research for an upcoming case," Pitts said dismissively. "What case?" Benjamin asked. "That's not your concern." "The ledger wasn't returned to its proper location. The log shows." "Mr. Walsh." Pitts set down his pen and looked at Benjamin with the expression of a man explaining basic arithmetic to a slow child. "Judge Harriman is a respected member of this court. If he needed to review documents, I'm certain he had good reason. Your job is to file papers, not interrogate judges about their work. Is that understood?" Benjamin understood perfectly. He understood that his supervisor was afraid. That evening, Benjamin did something he had never done before. Instead of walking straight home, he turned down Commerce Street and headed toward the Harrison County Library. If he couldn't access the courthouse's old newspapers directly, they were kept in a locked archive. Perhaps the library's collection would tell him something about Belleair Plantation. The library was quiet, nearly empty. Miss Sarah Dewcamps, the head librarian, was a rail-thin woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. She had worked at the library for 37 years and had read more of Harrison County's history than anyone alive. "Belleair," she repeated when Benjamin made his inquiry. Her expression shifted, something guarded entering her eyes. "That's a name I haven't heard in some time." "I'm researching property records," Benjamin said carefully. "For the courthouse." Miss Dewcombe studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded and disappeared into the stacks. She returned carrying 3 bound volumes of the Harrison Gazette dating from 1855 to 1870. "You'll want to start with August 1855. She said quietly. "That's when Belleair was established." And then she paused, her finger hovering over the spine of the 3rd volume. "You'll want to pay attention to the years between 1863 and 1868. Those years are complicated." Benjamin thanked her and carried the volumes to a reading table in the corner. He opened the 1st volume and began to read. Belleair Plantation had been established by a French Creole family named Devoe in 1855. According to the newspaper accounts, it was a modest operation compared to the massive cotton empires along the Mississippi River, only 800 acres with about 60 enslaved workers. The plantation changed hands in 1859, purchased by a consortium described only as private investors from New Orleans. The newspaper article was brief, almost dismissive. No names were listed. Benjamin flipped forward, skimming through reports of cotton yields, market prices, social events. Belleair appeared occasionally, but always vaguely. The plantation seemed to exist in the background of Harrison County life, noted, but never examined. Then came 1863. The war had reached Mississippi. Federal forces controlled much of the river. The Confederate economy was collapsing. And in the October 1863 edition of the Harrison Gazette, Benjamin found a small notice buried on page 7. "It has come to the attention of local authorities that certain irregularities exist in the management of Belleair Plantation. An investigation has been initiated by the Confederate Treasury Department regarding discrepancies in reported cotton yields and tax assessments. Further information will be provided as developments warrant." No follow-up article ever appeared. Benjamin's pulse quickened. He leaned closer to the yellowed newsprint. "Treasury investigation. What kind of irregularities? And why was no resolution reported?" He continued reading. The war years were chaotic in the newspaper. Reports of battles, casualty lists, desperate calls for supplies. But Belleair never appeared again until May 1865. Right after the surrender. Property at Belleair Plantation has been placed under federal oversight pending resolution of ownership disputes. Former residents are advised to present claims to the Freedmen's Bureau office in Natchez. Former residents. That was the newspaper's delicate term for people who had been enslaved. Benjamin felt something cold settling in his chest. Ownership disputes meant that the enslaved people at Belleair were trying to claim land, trying to prove they had rights to the property. It meant there was documentation, evidence, legal basis for their claims. He flipped forward desperately now, searching for more information. There. June 1867, the Circuit Court has ruled against claims filed by former residents of Bella of Plantation. Judge Victor Lansfield determined that insufficient documentation exists to support land transfer assertions. The property will be liquidated and sold at public auction. Judge Lansfield noted that while the claimant's circumstances elicit sympathy, the law requires clear evidence of ownership agreements which has not been satisfactorily provided. Benjamin sat back in his chair. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but it was a picture with crucial elements missing. The enslaved people at Bellier had tried to claim the land. They must have had some basis for this documents, agreements, something that made them believe they had legal rights. But the judge ruled against them because they couldn't provide sufficient evidence. What if the evidence had existed? What if it had been in that ledger? And what if powerful families, the private investors from New Orleans who had purchased Bellier in 1859, had something to hide about their ownership? About what happened at that plantation during and after the war? Benjamin closed the newspaper volumes. His hands were trembling slightly. Miss Dewcamps appeared beside his table so quietly he startled. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. "I found questions," Benjamin said carefully. Miss Dewcamp glanced around the empty library. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My brother worked at the Fleury Eadman's bureau office in 1866. He said the Bellier case was the strangest he ever encountered. The people who filed claims weren't asking for charity or reparations. They had specific information, dates, names, transactions. They said they'd been promised land, that agreements had been made. But when they went to court, all the documentation had vanished. The plantation owner's records, the sale documents, everything. The only things left were tax assessments and basic property boundaries. Who owned Bellier? Benjamin asked. Who were these investors? Miss Dewcamp shook her head. My brother tried to find out. He sent inquiries to New Orleans, to the land office, to the War Department. He never received straight answers, and then she paused. Then he was transferred to Alabama very suddenly. He wrote to me once after that, told me to let Bellier rest, said some doors were better left closed. Benjamin felt the weight of her warning. But he also felt something else. A burning need to understand what Judge Harriman had been trying to hide. Benjamin's boarding house sat on a quiet street lined with oak trees. He rented a single room on the second floor, modest, clean, with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a window overlooking the street. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, watching shadows move across the ceiling, thinking about ledgers and missing documents and judges who visited courthouses at midnight. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, he heard it. Footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate footsteps climbing to the second floor. The boarding house had 4 rooms on this level. Benjamin's was at the end of the hall. The footsteps passed the first room, the second room, the third room. They stopped outside his door. Benjamin's heart hammered. He sat up slowly, quietly, his eyes fixed on the door handle. In the dim light filtering through his window, he watched it begin to turn. He was on his feet instantly, grabbing the wooden chair from his desk. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The door handle stopped moving. There was a long silence, then a voice. Male, low, carefully controlled. "Mr. Walsh, I strongly advise you to focus on your courthouse duties and nothing more. Curiosity about old records can lead to unfortunate complications." "Who are you?" Benjamin demanded. No answer. The footsteps retreated down the hallway, descending the stairs. By the time Benjamin pulled open his door and looked out, the hallway was empty. He didn't sleep the rest of that night. Benjamin knew he couldn't do this alone. If he was going to pursue this, and some stubborn part of him insisted that he must, he needed someone he could trust. He thought of Lydia Mathis. Lydia was a teacher at the Harrison County School for Colored Children. Benjamin had met her 2 years earlier when she'd come to the courthouse to file a complaint about unsafe conditions at the school building. While other clerks had dismissed her, Benjamin had helped her navigate the bureaucracy, had shown her which forms to file, which officials to petition. The school had eventually gotten its repairs. Since then, they'd developed an unlikely friendship. They were both outsiders in their own ways. Benjamin, the quiet cler who noticed too much. Lydia, the educated black woman who refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose. If anyone would understand why this mattered, it was Lydia. He found her that Saturday afternoon in the school's small library organizing donated books. She looked up when he entered, surprise crossing her face. "Mr. Walsh, this is unexpected." "Ms. Mathis, I apologize for the intrusion. I need to speak with you about something sensitive." Her expression sharpened. "Coming." "Close the door." Benjamin told her everything. The missing ledger, Judge Harriman's midnight visit, the newspaper accounts of Belia, the stranger outside his door. Lydia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she walked to the window and stood there for a long moment, her arms crossed. "My grandmother worked at Belia," she said. Finally, Benjamin felt the air leave his lungs. Her name was Ruth. She was 14 when the war ended. She's 74 now, still alive, still sharp as a blade. Lydia turned to face him. "She doesn't talk about Belia. She's never talked about it, not in all my life. But a few times when I was young, I heard her wake up screaming in the night. And once I heard her say a name, Harriman." The room felt very cold. "Judge Theodore Harriman," Benjamin whispered. "I don't know." She never explained. "But Mr. Walsh, if you're asking me whether something terrible happened at that plantation, something that powerful people want to keep hidden, yes, I believe that absolutely." "Will your grandmother talk to me?" Lydia shook her head. "She won't talk to you, but she might talk to me if I ask the right way. Give me time." 3 days later, Lydia came to Benjamin's boarding house. Her face was drawn, her eyes haunted. "My grandmother talked," she said. "You need to hear this." They walked to a small park where they could speak privately. Lydia sat on a bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Hillary wasn't a plantation in the traditional sense, she began. "Not by the end of the war anyway. It was something else entirely. My grandmother said that starting in 1863, it became a kind of experiment." "What kind of experiment?" "The owners and my grandmother said there were multiple owners, powerful men from New Orleans and as far away as Richmond. They had a theory. They believed that slavery was evolving, that after the war, legal ownership might end, but economic control could continue. So they started making agreements." Benjamin leaned forward. "What kind of agreements?" "They told enslaved people at Belia that they could earn their freedom and land if they worked, if they increased production, if they met certain quotas. They would be given deeds to parcels of the plantation. After the war, everything was documented. Names, hours worked, production levels. My grandmother said there was a man who came once a month, a man in a dark suit who recorded everything in a leather book. She remembers him very clearly. He had red hair and a scar on his left hand. Why would slaveholders offer this? Because they knew the war was lost. They were looking ahead. If slavery ended, but they still controlled the land, and if the former enslaved people owed them money earned through this system, but never quite enough to fully own their parcels, then they could keep those people bound to the plantation through debt instead of chains. It was capitalism dressed up as charity. Benjamin felt sick. But the people at Belia didn't know this. Some suspected. But what choice did they have? Work with no promise of anything, or work with a chance at freedom and land? They worked. God. My grandmother said they worked like nothing you've ever seen. They believed what happened. Lydia's voice dropped. May 1865. Union soldiers came to Belarive. The war was over. The enslaved people presented their claims. They had records of their work, verbal promises from the overseers. But when the soldiers asked to see the official documentation, the ledger where everything was recorded, it couldn't be found. The man with the red hair had vanished. The main owner, my grandmother said his name was Pritchard, claimed no such agreements existed. He said the enslaved people were confused, desperate, making up stories. But there were witnesses. The agreements were public knowledge on the plantation. The testimony of enslaved people against white men. Mr. Walsh, You know how that worked. The case went to court in 1867. The people from Belia tried to prove their claims, but without the ledger, without documentation, they had nothing the court would accept. Judge Victor Lansfield ruled against them. Benjamin's mind raced. And Judge Harriman, Lydia met his eyes. My grandmother said Theodore Harriman was one of the owners. He was younger then, not yet a judge. He was a lawyer representing the consortium that purchased Belia in 1859. She remembered him because he came to the plantation 3 times. Once in 1859 during the purchase, Snorts, once in 1864 to inspect operations, and once in April 1865 right before the surrender. That final visit, my grandmother saw him burning papers in the plantation office. Stacks and stacks of papers. She was bringing water to the main house and saw him through the window. Benjamin stood up, his legs unsteady. The pieces were connecting now, forming a devastating picture. The ledger survived the burning, he said slowly. Somehow it ended up in the courthouse records. Maybe it was filed away by mistake. Maybe someone saved it deliberately. But it existed all these years, forgotten. And now with talk of renewed investigations into Reconstruction-era fraud, with the federal government finally looking into cases where freed people were cheated out of land claims, someone remembered the ledger. Lydia finished. Someone realized it was still out there. Documentation that could destroy reputations, implicate powerful families in fraud. So they sent Judge Harriman to make it disappear. Who else was involved? You said multiple owners. My grandmother remembered some names. Pritchard. He was the primary owner, a man named Desmond Carlisle from New Orleans. Senator James Vaughan, and 2 others she only heard mentioned, Fitch and Harrove. Benjamin felt the ground shift beneath him. Senator Vaughan's son was now the governor. The Carlisle family owned the largest bank in 3 states. Hargrove was the name of the current state attorney general. These weren't just powerful families. These were dynasties. Benjamin knew what he had to do. He had to find evidence that Judge Harriman had destroyed the ledger, and he had to find proof of what was in it before it disappeared. But the courthouse was now dangerous. After the stranger's visit, Benjamin had no doubt he was being watched. If he started asking questions directly, he would be stopped. Or worse, he needed to be clever. He remembered something Miss Camps had mentioned, the Confederate Treasury investigation in 1863. If the Treasury Department had investigated Belia, there should be a report somewhere. Most Confederate records had been captured by Union forces and eventually archived. The question was where. He spent his lunch hour at the telegraph office and sent inquiries to archives in Washington, D.C., Baton Rouge, and Atlanta. He identified himself as a courthouse clerk conducting research for historical documentation, which was technically true, if misleading. 3 weeks passed. Benjamin continued his normal duties, careful not to show any unusual interest in old records. He felt eyes on him constantly, though he couldn't identify who was watching. Then, in early May, he received a response from the National Archives in Washington. The sentence was considered harsh by some, lenient by others. Harriman was 57 years old. 15 years meant he would likely die in prison. At the sentencing, the judge, a federal appointee from Ohio, carefully selected to ensure impartiality, spoke directly to Harriman. You were entrusted with the law. You were educated, privileged, given every advantage. And you used your intelligence not to seek justice, but to perpetrate one of the most calculated frauds I have encountered. You exploited desperate people, made false promises to those who had no power to demand accountability, and then spent decades ensuring the truth remained hidden. The law you claimed to serve was betrayed by your actions. This court cannot undo the harm you caused. We cannot restore the land that should have been given to the people of Belia. We cannot compensate them for 26 years of injustice. But we can make clear that such actions will not be tolerated. That destroying evidence and using power to suppress truth carries consequences. Harriman stood silently, his face expressionless. He was taken to federal prison in Indiana. He would serve 9 years before dying of pneumonia in 1900. The other trust members faced various consequences. Desmond Carlisle's estate was sued by descendants of Belleair workers, resulting in a settlement. Governor Vaughan was not charged criminally. His father had died in 1878 and there was insufficient evidence of the governor's personal involvement. But the scandal severely damaged his political career. Arnold Fitch died 3 weeks after the trial ended. In the months following the trial, Benjamin Walsh found himself unexpectedly celebrated. Newspapers called him the clerk who wouldn't let go, the man who exposed a judge's crimes. He received job offers from courthouses across the country. He turned them all down. Instead, he stayed in Harrison County and helped rebuild the courthouse record system. He implemented new protocols for document security, for access logging, for preservation. He became deputy clerk, then chief clerk. He never forgot that his persistence had nearly cost him everything. But he also never forgot that persistence had mattered. Lydia Mattis continued teaching. The school board's concerns evaporated once the trial concluded and public opinion shifted. She became principal of the Harrison County School for Colored Children in 1897 and held the position for 23 years. She and Benjamin remained friends their entire lives. They met monthly for coffee, discussing books, politics, and the slow, frustrating progress toward justice. Ruth Mathis lived to see the trial's conclusion. She died in 1893 at 78 years old. At her funeral, Lydia read from Raymond Collins's ledger the entries listing Ruth's name, her work, her promised 5 acres. She never got her land, Lydia said. But she got her truth told. And sometimes when justice is slow, truth has to be enough to start with. The Belleair case established legal precedent. Federal courts began reviewing other Reconstruction-era land fraud cases with renewed scrutiny. While many claims were too old to prosecute, some resulted in civil settlements. It wasn't full justice, but it was acknowledgement. It was recognition that crimes had been committed, that people had been cheated, that the historical record needed correction. Robert Parrish continued his work with the Justice Department. He investigated dozens of similar cases across the South. Few resulted in criminal convictions. The Belleair case was exceptional in its documentation, but his work helped push Congress to establish compensation programs for proven land fraud victims. As for the question that started everything, why Judge Harriman chose April 1891 to destroy the ledger, the answer came during the trial. Congress had been considering a new round of Reconstruction claims investigations. A committee was planning to review old cases where freed people had been denied land they'd been promised. Belleair was on a list of plantations flagged for re-examination. Someone, likely someone with government connections, warned the surviving trust members that their case might be reopened. Harriman, the only one with access to the last remaining documentation, took action. He almost got away with it. He would have gotten away with it if not for a clerk who noticed a discrepancy in a logbook, if not for a librarian who remembered an old story, if not for a grandmother who was willing to finally speak, if not for a widow who preserved her husband's careful records for 24 years. In 1895, Benjamin Walsh was cataloging newly reconstructed courthouse records when he found something interesting. Tucked into a property file was a fragment of a document, a corner of a page partially burned that had somehow survived the courthouse fire. The fragment contained only a few words: transfer of land parcels to the following named individuals upon satisfaction of labor obligations as documented herein. Ruth Mathis 5 acres section 14. It was a piece of the original Belleair agreement. Proof that the promises had been real, had been documented, had existed. Benjamin held the fragment carefully. He could have publicized it, used it to strengthen the historical record. Instead, he placed it in an envelope, wrote evidence of truth on the outside, and gave it to Lydia. Lydia showed it to her grandmother, Ruth, who held the fragile paper in her weathered hands and cried. "We weren't crazy," Ruth whispered. "We weren't making it up. It was real." That fragment is now preserved in the archives of the Mississippi Department of History. Historians who have examined it confirm its authenticity. It remains one of the few physical pieces of evidence from the Belleair labor agreement program. But questions remain. Questions that will never be fully answered. How many other plantations ran similar schemes? How many other labor incentive programs existed during the final years of the war, promising freedom and land to desperate people, then destroying the documentation when those promises became inconvenient? How many other ledgers were destroyed? How many other clears fled into the night carrying secrets? How many other judges and officials spent decades protecting powerful families and their dark legacies? The Belair case was one of the few where the truth emerged, but it emerged only because of unlikely coincidences, persistent individuals, and a widow who kept her husband's ledgers in a locked box for 24 years. How many truths didn't emerge? How many are still buried, still protected, still hidden behind the names of respectable families and the sealed records of forgotten courthouses? The Bella of Plantation itself is gone now. The land was divided, sold, developed. Houses sit where cotton fields once stretched. A church occupies what was once the main plantation house's footprint. There is no historical marker, no monument to the 60 people who worked there, who believed promises, who were cheated. The official records were destroyed twice. Once by Harriman in 1865, once in the courthouse fire of 1891. But the truth survived imperfectly, incompletely, but survived. And that has to matter because if one carefully kept ledger could eventually expose decades of lies, if one persistent clerk could unravel a conspiracy, if one elderly woman's testimony could force powerful men to finally face consequences, then maybe, just maybe, the truth always leaves traces. The question is whether anyone notices, whether anyone cares enough to follow those traces, whether anyone is willing to risk comfort and safety to pursue justice for people they never knew, for crimes committed before they were born. Benjamin Walsh was such a person. So was Lydia Mathis. So was Raymond Collins fleeing into the night with his copies, hoping someday they might matter. They did matter. But how many other copies are still out there, still waiting in locked boxes and forgotten attics, still holding secrets about other plantations, other judges, other families who destroyed records linking them to crimes they never wanted acknowledged? The Bellarive case began with a single, unsettling question: what was written in that missing ledger? But it led to a far more troubling anear: how much of our history is gone, not because time wore it away, but because someone chose to erase it? That question has no final answer.